Now for today's program. Billy Vera is an American singer, songwriter, actor, author, and music historian. His most successful record, At This Moment, was featured on the hit TV show Family Ties in 1987. His songwriting career in the 1960s included writing for Barbara Lewis, Fats Domino, the Shirelles, and Ricky Nelson. His song, I Really Got the Feeling, was a #1 hit for Dolly Parton. In 1979, he created the band Billy Vera and the Beaters, and they still perform today. Billy has helped produce, archive, and write liner notes for over 200 reissue albums and sets from artists such as Little Richard, Sam Cooke, and Ray Charles, among many others. In 2013, Billy won a Grammy Award. His books include his memoir entitled Harlem to Hollywood and Rip It Up, the Specialty Records Story. Billy's star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame can be found at the corner of Vine Street and Yucca Street, right in front of the Capitol Records building in Hollywood. Joining Billy tonight is award-winning journalist Nadine Epstein, editor-in-chief and CEO of Moment Magazine. She is the founder and executive director of the Center for Creative Change. Nadine is the editor of Elie Wiesel, An Extraordinary Life and Legacy. Her most recent book is RBG's Brave and Brilliant Women, 33 Jewish Women to Inspire Everyone, which she wrote in collaboration with the late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Please welcome Billy Vera and Nadine Epstein.
Thank you so much. Hi, Billy. Thank you for being here.
Good to see you.
I just want to start by saying that Art Rupe was an amazing person. I did not personally know him as a record producer, as the independent record producer who made gospel records and who, which then gave birth to R&B and then into rock and roll. I didn't know him at all as that person. All that happened, most of that happened before I was even born. But I just have to start by saying that I knew him as a cousin and as a person who I was very close to and who I loved dearly. And he was my partner in learning about our family history, which was a topic of great fascination to both of us for many, many years. And he died on April 15th. Which was tax day, which I think actually, come to think of it, in retrospect, was a very interesting day for him to have passed away. But Billy and I can talk about that later. And I'm still just getting used to the idea that he's not here with us, as he's always been with us. So I thought, before I start interviewing Billy, who also knew him in a whole different way and has been knowing him even longer than I did, that I just want to tell everyone a little bit about where Art grew up and a little bit about the family history. And Suzanne has a few photos that she's going to put up. So just so everyone knows, so Art grew up, he was born in the United States, and he grew up in McKeesport, Pennsylvania. And in 2011, he and I took a trip back to McKeesport to revisit his family roots and go visit my family roots. Were the same roots. And but we went back and we, went to schools and cemeteries and to where his house used to be. And here's a photo, by the way. I'll just start out. This is my great-grandfather and Art's grandfather. And this is Harry Goldberg. And Art was originally Arthur Newton Goldberg. And Harry, this is a picture of Harry, who lived in Greensburg, Pennsylvania, which was close by to McKeesport. And Harry becomes very important to Art Rupe's story because he tells Art, when Art's a little boy, that Goldberg isn't really his real name. And this leads to something that changes in Art that we'll talk about in a little bit. You want to show some of the other photos, Suzanne? This is actually a picture of Art from 2011. And so when I say he grew up poor, he was really they were very poor. He had 3 siblings, and this was the lot where his house used to be. And his house was something like that. We actually found some houses that looked just like his house. And then the next photo, please. So Art was a star Hebrew school student, and this was his Hebrew school. This was his temple. And he was offered a rabbinical scholarship, which he turned down to go to college and then go to Hollywood. And this is a very important photo. I have a lot of photos. This might not be the best one of them, but this is Art at Zion Baptist Church, which is right near the house that he grew up in. And he could hear the music from the church just in the street. And he would just sit outside and listen to music. And he and I went back to the church to revisit. This is where he fell in love with gospel music. And I wanted to, oh yes, and this is me and Art at the wedding of his granddaughter. So I think it's already like 5 years ago. I just don't remember what year it was. And here we are at the wedding as well. These are just beautiful photos, family photos. So Art grew up really poor, and he grew up in a community where Blacks and Jews lived together. And I just want to read one thing that he wrote, and then I'm going to turn us over to Billy. I interviewed him in 2000. Actually, this is the first issue I did of Moment magazine, which I was in charge after when I became editor and of Moment. And I interviewed him for that issue, and he wrote about growing up in McKeesport. There was a tremendous amount of ethnic intermingling, he says. In a picture I remember seeing of myself with my classmates, I looked like a sugar cube in a coal bin. We were all poor, and whether white or Black, aspects of our culture were the same. I particularly enjoyed listening to blues records in one of my Black friends' homes. What bonded us was a culture shaped by our similar economic status, not our ethnicity. And this leads to Art leaves McKeesport to go out into the world. And he ends up driving out to Hollywood with a couple friends. And Billy, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about how you met Art?
Well, I was a fan of specialty records since I was 12 years old when I bought my first Little Richard record. And I also fell in love with the actual visual, the look of the label, the white, yellow, and black label that if you were at a party and there were a bunch of 45 RPM records on a table there, that was the label that jumped out of the table and grabbed your eye. And so I always wanted to know what was special about specialty.
What year was this, by the way?
When I was 12?
Yeah, well, this is like, yeah.
I was 1956, I would have been 12.
Okay, great.
When Little Richard was just breaking through really big. And so a few years later, there were other artists on specialty. It was Larry Williams. I bought his records. Mm. And there was a friend of mine, he and his brother had moved up from the Bronx, and they were a couple of tough guys, you know. And one of them, Kevin Falcone, worked in a record store. And he would introduce me to different artists than the usual artists. And one day, by this time I'm about 18 years old and I'm working in nightclubs with my band. Kevin came into the club one night and he brought a stack of 45s about this high. And among them were some specialty records by artists I had never heard of. They were older records. Kevin had liberated the records from the store where he worked. And so this grew and grew and grew. When I moved to California later in 1979, started a band, and I still hadn't met the great man, Art Rupe. But around 1989, a friend brought me to the company, which the company by that time was one little room and a closet where the files were kept. And Art's daughter, Beverly, was running the label for Art, which at that time, running the label meant servicing oldies accounts for for jukeboxes and stuff like that, because the company was not making records anymore. And Beverly asked me, she said, someone has compiled a Little Richard box set. Would you give me your honest opinion about it?
Mm-hmm.
I said, so I took a look at it. I took a listen to it. And I said, well, you want my honest opinion? She said, yes, I really need this. I don't really know much about the record business. I said, well, first of all, the thing is all over the place. It should be done in chronological order so as to show the growth of Richard as an artist,
Mm-hmm.
rather than just a hit here and a hit there. And she liked that. And she said, well, what else do you think? I said, well, you know, you want to make a nice cover so that people will see it and like it. So I suggested a friend of mine, an award-winning album designer,
Mm-hmm.
and he designed a lovely, very hip cover. And so we put it out, and the box set was well received. And voila, I'm a record producer.
And they hired you then you got hired later on to be producing these records.
Yeah,
So
yeah, shortly. Well, she was very pleased, and Art was very pleased with the box set, and pleased with my work. And so,
and that started this friendship that you had with him all the way to the end of his life, right?
absolutely, to the very end. To the very
You were,
end.
yeah. I met Billy at the Shiva. So that's how we started talking, and I realized he has so many great stories to tell. So let's step back a little bit into Art's life and tell a little bit about his story. So in, I think, was it 1939? What year he takes off and he drives out with some friends to Los Angeles? What?
To Hollywood, yeah.
Hollywood.
He wanted
Along the way, the car breaks down, and Art works in a whole bunch of jobs in like the circus industry. Like he works in at a circus and a carnival in order to make the money to get them the rest of the way to Los Angeles. And he never goes home. He never goes back.
Right.
And so he gets out there, and he wants to get into the film business, and he can't get in, can't break in, but he finds this little niche. Tell us a little bit. So how does he get into the record business?
Well, he found the movie business to be too, as in his words, were too clubby. You know, it was he just couldn't find his way in. And so he was very methodical man. And so he approached, what am I going to do now, in his usual methodical way. And he looked around the music business, which was still show business, and he saw that this was World War II, and records were made out of shellac. Shellac comes from Asia. The Japanese controlled Asia, so there was very little shellac brought to America at that time. So what happened as a result is the major companies, the RCAs, the Columbias, the Deccas, began to trim their rosters and concentrate on their big stars, the Bing Crosbys and people like that. And so Art looked around, he said, what was being neglected? He found a vacuum that he could fill. And that was in black music, which he knew very well. He loved black music. So he was down to his last $600, and he took 200 of those 600, and he took a bus down to the black section of town, South Central Los Angeles, and he bought $200 worth of records. And he said, I listened to them, the good ones and the bad ones. And I wanted to determine why some were hits and some were flops. And so I took a stopwatch, I took a metronome, I counted the number of measures in the music. I noticed that the word boogie was in a lot of the titles. He said, and I found out, I discovered that the biggest customers for records were not retail so much as they were jukebox operators. Mm-hmm. So I decided to name my record company Jukebox Records. And I found a little...
And that was his first company before Specialty, yeah.
correct. And he said, I found a little quartet because I didn't have a lot of money to record a big band. He said, I love the big bands, the Count Basies, the Duke Ellingtons, the Lucky Millanders, but I had no money to record a 15, 18-piece band. So I found a quartet called the Sepia Tones. And I made a record with them, a boogie, and I called it Boogie Number One. And he sold about 70,000 records, which was a lot of records in 1944. And so he said, with that money that he made, he had working capital now, with which he could find other artists. And he found 3 of them. He found a woman named Marian Abernathy, who he renamed the Blues Woman. Mm-hmm. And he found another man named Roosevelt Sykes, who had made some good selling records in the 1930s. And he renamed Roosevelt Sykes the Blues Man. Mm-hmm. And most successful of all, he found another fellow named Roy Milton. Roy Milton and his Solid Senders. And the Marian Abernathy record became a hit. And the first record by Roy Milton became a hit. And now he was in business. And he was basically going to be, for the next 3 or so years, he was basically in the Roy Milton business, even though he put out occasional records by other people. But he concentrated on Roy. Roy went on to have 19 top 10 hits in the decade that he was with Specialty Records. Mm-hmm. Oh, I should say that he had partners in jukebox records. And when Royalty Time came out, he became a little suspicious. And so he broke up Specialty Jukebox, and he kept his master recordings, and he decided to start up another label, which he called Specialty. Now, where was Specialty Records? Well, there were these little outfits where they would rent you a desk, and they would answer a phone for you. And he took a cigar box, and that became the place where he put the bills and the invoices and the money. And they would answer the phone, and that was the address, official address of Jukebox and then Specialty Records, mm-hmm. until he made enough money to open up a little office down on Venice Boulevard, which becomes mm-hmm. an important name, which we'll discuss later, I suppose. But yes, that was down near the Olympic Auditorium. The Olympic Auditorium, where there were a lot of shows, there were boxing, matches there, all kinds of stuff, basketball games.
So he eventually also brings on Lloyd Price, who also becomes who has a lot of hits.
That was a few years later.
Yeah.
But before that, he started to became a going concern. Mm-hmm. And, January 1st, 1948, James Petrillo, who was the president of the Musicians Union, called a strike, which did nobody any good. The amount of money that they were able to raise the union scale for recording sessions never matched the money they lost in the year that these poor musicians were out of work striking. Mm-hmm. So that meant no musicians could play on recording sessions for almost a whole year. And so Art's thinking, what do I do? What do I do? He said, well, these gospel groups, they don't use musicians. They sing a cappella. Yeah. So he found his group, the Pilgrim Travelers, and they sold quite well with no musicians. And mm-hmm. so that's how he survived during 1948. So then he was a sharp guy, and he was also a brilliant man, actually. And he whenever there was a problem, lemonade out of lemons, that kind of thing. He was good at that. So by 1950, he had signed this kid, Jimmy Liggins, whose older brother, Joe, had made a hugely successful record called The Honey Dripper for another company. Mm-hmm. Well, that company went out of business. So Art signed Joe. And Joe made a record called Pink Champagne, 1950. Now we're at 1950. No, that's 1949, I'm sorry. And that became the biggest rhythm and blues record. By now, race music, which was what the black music was called up until that time, was another friend of mine, Jerry Wexler of Atlantic Records, renamed
he did that. Yeah.
And so Joe had this record, Joe Liggins had this record, Pink Champagne, and it became a gigantic hit. So now Art had two big artists. Well, as if that wasn't enough, in walks a fellow, plays Art a song called Please Send Me Someone to Love, which had a wonderful, beautiful lyric, and Art signed a fellow that I named the poet of the blues. His name was Percy Mayfield. Most people will know Percy from his later songwriting. He later wrote Hit the Road Jack, which became Ray Charles's biggest record of all time. So now Art has Roy Milton, he has Joe Liggins, Jimmy Liggins, Percy Mayfield. And in Roy Milton's band is a wonderful piano player named Camille Howard, who also was a pretty good singer, and she sang on some of the hit records as well. So he's got a nice little stable of artists by 1950. And one of his gospel groups, the Soul Stirrers, they lost their lead singer. And in comes a young 19-year-old kid to take the place of the R.H. Harris, who was really the singer that Art liked. And Art wasn't so sure about this kid, this 19-year-old kid with a pretty face. His name was Sam Cooke. And of course, Sam brought something new to religious music, which was sex appeal, you know. And so women started to scream when he sang, as if they were singing, listening to Frank Sinatra, you know, or something like that. And but Sam stayed with gospel music for quite a number of years. And of course, Sam went on to become Sam Cooke, all capital letters.
Well, I'll ask you more about that later too.
Yeah, we'll talk.
And then after a little while in there, let's tell us a little bit about Richard Penniman, and then I will.
All right. Well, let me just mention Lloyd Price, who you mentioned.
Lloyd Price is amazing. Yes.
1952.
Lottie Miss Claudie.
Now, Art was a fan of Fats Domino, the great Fats Domino.
Oh.
In New Orleans, the fabulous fat man from New Orleans. So Art takes a scouting trip to New Orleans, and he booked a couple of days at a studio, J&M Music, owned by Cosimo Matassa. And there was a line out the door and around the block for, you know, people that wanted to become stars. And one after another, and Art was not happy. He was just about to pack it up and go home when in walks this kid. And he sang his song, and Art was like, eh. But then the kid noticed that Art was losing interest, and he started to cry as he sang his song over again. And Art was so impressed by the emotion in his voice that he said, I'm going to take a chance on you. And so they did a session. And out of that came a song called Lottie Miss Claudie by Lloyd Price, which was the first record, Art said, that crossed over. Because up till that time, specialty records business was totally black music, for black people.
Yeah.
And in fact, Jerry Wexler once described rhythm and blues better than anybody I ever heard. He said, rhythm and blues is black music for black adults, as opposed to rock and roll, which is for teenagers.
Mm-hmm.
Well, suddenly, Specialty's distributor in New Orleans called up Art, and he said, I'm having a strange phenomenon here. I'm getting, a lot of the record stores are reporting that these black housekeepers are coming into the stores and buying 2 copies of Lottie Miss Claudie, one for themselves and one for their employer's teenage kid. He said that was the first record that we made that crossed over into the white market and the white teenage market. And that was the first indication that there might be a market for rhythm and blues among teenagers, and specifically white teenagers as well as Black teenagers.
Mhm.
That was a big deal then.
Yes. So tell me a little bit about Little Richard, and then we have so many questions and not so much time. So,
Okay,
and
well,
by the way, I just want to say that Billy has written this book, which he described, Rip It Up, the specialty record story, which tells the whole story in great
Susan
detail,
has
which I highly recommend. But
Susan, thank you. Susan has a nice picture of it that she can.
yes, Suzanne does. But
Neil,
Neil, tell us a little.
Looking at our faces.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about Little Richard, and then we'll. Yeah.
All right, Little Richard had been around the block, as they say. He had recorded for RCA Victor in 1951, did 2 sessions for them, they dropped him. He recorded for Peacock Records in Houston, and that was an unhappy time for him. The guy that owned there was a Black gangster named Don Roby, and he slapped Richard around. He got very physical with him. And so Richard left Peacock, and he ran into Lloyd Price at a show, and he said, "I don't know what to do. I want to be a star. I want to be a star." You know, Richard was one of these people that gave new meaning to the word narcissism, you know, and you know, he'd had a very high opinion of himself, and so Lloyd said, "Well, why don't you make a demonstration record, and send it to Art Rupe at Specialty Records in Hollywood?" So Richard did as Lloyd told him. Got no response. So he also sent a copy of the demo to Atlantic Records and probably 5 or 6 other companies too. And he became a pest. Has Mr. Rupe heard my record yet? Mr. Rupe heard my record yet? Yeah, he'll get around to it. He'll get around to it. And when Art finally heard it, he wasn't that impressed. And I've heard that original demo, and it wasn't very impressive. He sounded like a run-of-the-mill rhythm and blues singer. You know, one of those things that comes across the transom. If anybody's old enough to remember what a transom is, it's that window at the top of the door in an office that comes through. And so finally, Richard's persistence paid off, and Art listened to it and said, "Look," he told his A&R man, Bumps Blackwell, he said, "Look, why don't you go down to New Orleans, meet Richard down there, do a session or 2 with him." So they go down there, same studio, Cosimo's, and they did a session in the morning, and it was mediocre. 4 songs. In those days, you did 4 songs. The union allowed you 4 songs in 3 hours, and if you went 1 second over, they'd charge you more. So you know you had to be very careful. So they take a lunch break. They go over to the Dewdrop Inn, and Richard, of course, was such a ham. He jumps up on the piano. He starts singing a somewhat risque song called "Tutti Frutti Good Booty, Wop Babaloo Mop a Good Goddamn." And Bumps heard in this song something new, something different, something he had never heard before. This was a song that Richard not only played, low-end nightclubs, but he also played for frat house boys, at colleges. And that kind of risque stuff is, you put together fraternity house boys with beer, and they want to hear dirty songs, basically. Mm-hmm. And so that was the song. So Bumps got the bright idea. One of the songwriters who had written one of the songs for the morning session was a woman named Dorothy Labostri, who was having lunch there as well. And he goes to Dorothy and he says, "You think you can clean up the lyrics to this song?" And she said, "I'll give it a try." So for this afternoon session, they recorded Tutti Frutti. And of course, this song was something that nobody had ever heard before. It was, there had been, rock and roll had just started with Chuck Berry, of course, predated Richard. The Fats Domino predated Richard. But this record was wild. It was out of control. It gave the feeling of madness. And of course, just the thing that 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old teenagers love. They loved it then, they loved it now, they'll love it 20 years from now. They'll love madness, because that's the way you are when you're a teenager. And we've all been teenagers, so, or we've all had teenagers in many cases. So Richard is now a star, you know, and he went on to have quite a few hit records himself.
Well, let me just change course a little bit. I remember that I was reading in your book that Art actually wrote a memo to his people who were representing him in New Orleans about what he was looking for in music. And one of the biggest things was feeling. He wanted to produce, he was looking for a feeling. That was what drew him to gospel music. And that's what drew him to all music, was authentic feeling.
Correct.
And so now Art's in the business, and I want to tell a little story that I know Billy knows. So David Goldberg, my great uncle, and my great aunt Anna Goldberg, go to visit their son in California. And remember, these are really fairly uneducated but very smart people who, have lived very simply their entire lives. And they come to Hollywood, and at this point, Art has bought a house on Mulholland Drive in Beverly Hills. And David, do you want to tell the story? And David and Anna come into the house, and what does David say? Do you want to?
Well, this is new to me.
Oh, I'll tell the story then. Okay.
Yeah,
So David goes into the house. Art told me the story all the time. And my great uncle took his finger and went to Art and brings him outside outside the front door and goes, "Are you a ganef?" Now, ganef means thief in Yiddish. And of course, by the way, Art knew Yiddish. And Art was like totally taken aback by this and was, no, absolutely not, because David just could not imagine that his son would live in Beverly Hills at a house with, all the accoutrements of a successful Hollywood independent record producer. So anyways, I was always touched, and he told me that story over and over again. And you had another story that you tell about David, and you tell it in the book.
Yes.
What a big influence that David Goldberg had on Art. Why don't you tell us that?
I will. The picture, which maybe Susan will show us now, of the Goldbergs in front of
yes, yeah, Suzanne.
That was earlier, before he lived up on Mulholland. No, that's me and my hero. There it is.
There they are. This is my great uncle and my great aunt and Anna, and there they are with Art outside Specialty Records.
Yes, that was the first Specialty Records office. So this is before he lived up on Mulholland. He was still living quite modestly at this point.
Yeah, and he doesn't have like all the fancy clothes or anything yet that he gets a little bit later.
As we can see.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so the story that you're referring to is, Art told me that when he was young, David worked in a used furniture shop. And one night he comes home from work, and he's going through the day's receipts, and he notices that he overpaid or underpaid, whatever it was, a customer by some minute amount, $1.25 or something like that. And he immediately puts on his overcoat, goes out in the snow to give the man back that dollar and whatever. And Art said that I never forgot that incident. He said it always ruled how I would conduct myself as a businessman. He said, and throughout my years as a businessman, I always would ask myself when a confusion came up, what would my father do? Now, to go along with that, Lloyd Price, who we mentioned earlier, who was a good businessman, unlike most artists who were lousy in business, Lloyd Price was a great businessman, and he ended his life this past year in the town, the village of Pound Ridge, New York, which is a very wealthy community in Upper Westchester County. Anyway, Lloyd told me, he said, as long as Art Rupe owned Specialty Records, I received a statement and a check every 6 months like clockwork. And that is something that can't be said about a lot of these gonifs. You know,
Yes, so let's talk about that, because there's definitely this trope, and I actually think it's a bit of an anti-Semitic trope. It is an anti-Semitic trope that, you know, Jewish independent producers of this era took advantage of their Black artists. There's so many things to unpack there, because first of all, there were Black independent producers. It was a, you know, Jews were not the only ones in the business. But so there's a whole conversation there to be had. But Art, did you find that he had a reputation for treating his artists very fairly?
Yeah, Art had a great reputation, and also another fellow named Lou Chudd had a great reputation. He owned Imperial Records, and they were sort of friendly rivals, you know. And at Specialty, we hired a woman who worked for Lou Chudd, who had worked for Lou Chudd back in his heyday. And she told me that Lou, whenever his instructions to her was, whenever a check comes in for one of our artists, if there's an odd penny, make sure that the artist gets that penny, that extra penny. He said, I always want them to feel that they're being paid fairly. So there were that, and as you indicate, there were record men and some women. There was Bess Berman from Apollo Records, and Florence Greenberg from Scepter Records, and so they were Jews, of course, but some of the Don Roby, as I said before, was Black. Berry Gordy, of course, was and is Black, and the people that owned VJ Records were Black. And a friend of mine, who was one of the first rhythm and blues artists to come, the first rhythm and blues artist to make a hit record out of New Orleans, Paul Gayton. He always said, you know, and he was Black, Paul was Black, and he said, nobody F's the Black man like the Black man, which, you know, so it had nothing to do with ethnicity, whether somebody was honest or dishonest. But,
and also, wasn't there a different royalty system? I mean, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but there was a different kind of royalty system back then that was different from today.
Well, it evolved like everything else. You know, I mean, in the early days, there was no royalties. A band leader or whoever the artist was paid a flat fee for the recording session. And if the artist was lucky enough to be the songwriter, then the federal law was, from back in 1902, whenever it was that a song, to use a song on a record, the price was 2 cents per record sold, 1 cent going to the publisher, 1 cent going to the writer. Well, why did the publisher get that cent? Because the publisher collects the money, which is something that no artist is equipped to do. So Art opened up Venice Music to publish the songs that his artists wrote. So the artist could make money as a songwriter, could make royalties rather as a songwriter. And then later in the 40s, most of the companies started to pay royalties in addition to the union scale payments that for the recording session itself. This came about slowly, and every company didn't do it at once.
Mhm.
You know, some resisted. You know,
Well,
to
Art
that.
also started Herald Attractions, and Herald Attractions was
Yes,
a way of making sure that his artists were booked fairly and getting bookings for shows,
right.
and they were not, and he didn't take any cut at all. All the money went right to the artists, as I understand, right?
Which is unheard of, because you know generally a booking agent is paid 10% of the artist, of what he gets for the artist. But Art said, I'm not interested in the money. By that time, you know, Art was, he said when he first started making money, he got a tax bill for 90% of his income. So he was like anybody with half a brain, and Art had like 10 times the brain that most people had. He just looked for ways to write off. One of the ways he wrote off was to have Herald Attractions. So all the costs of doing business, he could write off his taxes. He also invested in distributorships, which usually as a silent partner, but again, he could write off those investments tax-wise, and so, you know, he learned a way around, a legal way, of course, around what he considered to be unfair.
Yeah, he told me that it was the first time when he got that bill that he had an accountant, and that's when he learned that there are things called tax shelters.
Yes.
And that's one of the things that led him to get into oil and gas, which is what he does later on, and later after his record producing career, he goes into a whole nother field, which he learns and from scratch. By the way, he's you know, he masters it the same way he masters the record industry. And that was why I was kind of making a reference earlier that it was, you know, it turns out I hadn't really thought about it until I was looking at some of the obituaries today that he actually died on April 15th,
Yes.
which is tax day, which is also what he also became a Republican, as he would tell many people, when he got that 90% tax bill.
That'll do it.
He went from, but he had a very interesting whole political way of looking at the world, which is a whole different story. I want to talk a tiny bit before we go into the Beatles and what happened to the Beatles and Sam Cooke. I just want to stop and talk about the payola system. So that was part of the record industry, was that you paid off DJs to play your music. And this was something that Art detested. And part of this was one of the reasons also that led him to get out of the business. He just didn't want to be part. And now, reading your book, I realized that he did actually for a while have to do some of this to get some of his artists, but you know, to be played on the air. But this was something that really drove him out of the business.
Yeah, he was very reluctantly ended up doing some payola. He hated it. He loathed it. He felt it was corrupt. He felt it. He said, "I always believed in a level playing field."
Yes.
And he said, "I felt that these disc jockeys were taking money off the work and the efforts of others, the people that actually made the records, made the music." And I found some letters in the files between himself and Alan Freed, who's the self-described king of rock and roll, who was really the disc jockey that did more than any other disc jockey to bring rock and roll to the public. And you know, we can see in the correspondence that Freed is trying to hustle Art, and Art knows what's going on, but he also knew that he was kind of trapped, that he kind of had to do it, and at first he resisted, and then they came back together, and then once Little Richard started to take off, well, Freed really couldn't say no. I'm not going to play Little Richard records, because he would lose street cred, as we call it. with his fans. So that was that. But it was something that really irked Art, his sense of fairness, you know.
Well, I have two more quick questions because I want to leave a little time for other people to ask questions too. But one is that famously, just very briefly, that basically Sam Cooke and Art, they have a breakup. Just tell us really briefly what happened and how and what Art said about that later.
Sure. Sam had become so popular in gospel, he wanted to try spread his wings and become a pop singer. And so they made one record. Art said, sure, let's do it. And made one record, and it wasn't very good. And so they made another one with Bumps Blackwell, Art's A&R man, producing. Sam had made some demos, just Sam singing and playing his guitar. And one of the songs that they recorded was a song called "You Send Me." So Art said, well, go ahead, do a session with Sam, use a small rhythm section and a vocal group, thinking that it was going to be a vocal group like the gospel group that Sam had sung with, the Soul Stirrers. So Art just happened to drop into the studio that night, and there, lo and behold, is a vocal group, but it's 2 white women and 2 white men. And Art was not too happy with that because he didn't feel that that was what, in his words, that's not what our market demanded. He said Sam had a thin voice, he needed to fatten it up with male voices. It wasn't the whiteness of them, I think, that bothered him so much. It was the fact that it was a thin sounding group behind a thin sounding voice. So they got in a big argument, and it wound up with Art saying, "What the hell with this? You know, I'll let you have this session in lieu of which, you know, you'll get no more, no future royalties, and you can have the record and take it where you want it." Well, so Bumps took it around to all the big companies in Hollywood and got turned down everywhere. And he finally ends up with this little nothing new, brand new record company, and the record sells 1 million copies. So Art, again, making lemonade out of lemons, he takes this guitar voice demo of Sam singing another song of his, and Art overdubs the same musicians that were on "You Send Me" and the same white singers that were on "You Send Me," and he makes a #1 record of his own, you know, just with the scraps of what he had to work with.
Wow.
So he was no fool. But he was, one thing that always irked him was that Sam screwed him. Sam put his brother's name on "You Send Me," which meant that the song, per contract, would not go into Venice Music as it should have, because that was the contract. And so, you know, he kind of screwed Art out of his share of the royalties.
I just want to say really briefly that Art also made another mistake, which is a kind of a famous mistake, or was that Little Richard, who was with Art on and off for many years, went to Europe and met this new group called the Beatles, and suggested to Art that he represent this group, and Art declined. At that point, Art was already he offered to continue to work with Little Richard, but he just had lost interest in the whole music industry. So let me just say, I just wanted to ask you a really quick question again. In retrospect, why was Specialty Records important? Like, just really briefly, if you could tell us, like, was it, you know, what did it add to the mix of the world? What did it add to the music mix of the world?
Well, I think Specialty Records was one of the cornerstones of rhythm and blues and rock and roll, along with Atlantic Records, Sun Records, of course, which we know from Elvis, along with Chess Records, which we know from Chuck Berry and Muddy Waters and all those people. And Specialty was right there, one of the four legs of the table, that was this music that has gone on to become the music, along with jazz, the music of America.
Great. I think somewhere you also wrote that it was like Blue Note and jazz. It was that really that influential in your book, which I like that quote. I just want to, before we go on to get to quick questions, I just want to talk a little bit about how Arthur Newton Goldberg became Art Rupe. So when Art was a little boy, he was talking to his grandfather, Harry Goldberg, and Harry told him that before he came to the United States, his name had been Harry Rupe. It really was Harry Rupp. But that he had changed his name when he came over to the United States, because when he was on the boat, people on the boat had said, Rupe sounds too much like rope, and it's not a good name to have in the United States. So this was something that, so when Art got out to Hollywood, he changed his name to Art Rupe. So he and I spent many, many years researching this to confirm that the family name was really Rupe. And it was, but it was Rupp. And as it turns out, Rupp does not mean rope, but it means Rav, which is rabbi. So all these years, Art was telling the story about rope, but it turns out that, in my mind, really, Art was really like a rabbi. He was just a really wise, smart man, a man who did not believe in God, but a man who had this incredible integrity that he just, he just radiated from him. So,
well, I can say that he was certainly a rabbi to me.
Yes. So Suzanne, were there any questions that?
Yeah, before we do that, I just real quickly want to spend 1 minute and just be able to see the pictures that.
There's Lloyd Price on the right with that magnificent, I love that tie. And that's his dad on the left.
Yeah.
And by the way, I just want to say that the Specialty Records, those colors, yellow, black, and white. So Art took UCLA business courses at UCLA, and he's the one who chose those colors because he felt they stood out so well.
So
Actually, that came from his marketing professor.
Not
for the label, but just we said I learned in my marketing class. My professor told me that, or told us, the class, that those three colors are the ones that stick, that grab the person's eye before any other colors.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. So here's just another picture.
So he represents Jimmy Liggins, and then later on he represents Joe Liggins, who's his older brother. I don't actually know Larry Williams, but
well, Larry had a hit called Boney Maroney, and another one called Short Fat Fanny.
Oh, wow.
Larry was a very good rock and roll songwriter, and several of his songs were recorded by the Beatles and the Rolling Stones.
He looks adorable.
Why did so many artists like the rhyming of the titles? Just because it was catchy?
I imagine, well, Larry's songs were very rock and roll-ish songs, and they were catchy, yes, and the like Chuck Berry's songs, the subject matter was very teenagey. Mm-hmm. There's Roy Milton on the left, who was Art's first hit artist. He was also a drummer, and in fact, when Art was in the studio, when Roy was in the studio, the sound of his snare drum, because he sang while he played the drums, made that beat more emphasis on the beat, and that was an element of what would become rock and roll. Now Don and Dewey were the two fellows on your right. They made some excellent records. They were big influence on the Righteous Brothers, and also as songwriters, they were much more successful as songwriters than they were as singers. In fact, one of their songs, "Leaving It All Up to You," was #1 on the pop charts twice. Once by Dale and Grace, and once by Donnie and Maria Osmond. And there's Camille on your left, and she was just a fabulous boogie woogie piano player and an excellent singer. And there's Sam on your right, but down at the bottom of the picture, and with all these older gentlemen who had been in the Soul Stirrers prior to Sam's joining them at age 19.
This is a great picture.
Backstage, preparing that pompadour, famous pompadour. This is a picture of Richard in the movie The Girl Can't Help It.
And then the book.
And then the book. With a foreword, you'll notice, by Art Rupe himself.
Mm-hmm. How did Art feel about being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame?
Well, it's funny. I'll try to make this as short as possible. For years, a lot of us wanted to get him into there, but Ahmet Ertegun, the owner of, the founder of Atlantic Records, he didn't believe. Maybe it's some jealousy, although why Ahmet had to be jealous of anyone is beyond me. But he said, Art Rupe didn't produce no records. And of course, I knew better because I had heard the tapes, you know, wherein Art is cajoling his artists. Okay, one more take. Let's do with a little more feeling, a little more soul. And Art would talk about changing the horn parts on a song, and that's what a producer does. So we had to wait until Ahmet Ertegun died, and then after 3 specialty artists had already been inducted to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame: Little Richard, Lloyd Price, and Sam Cooke, and they finally decided to induct Art. Well, he didn't want to go, and he said to me, he said, why don't you go and you accept the award in my place? I said, all right, I mean, I'll do anything for you. I love you. You're my friend. But I think you need to be there just to show them, you know, to hell with them. And I talked him into going, and he was, and Lloyd Price was the one who introduced him and handed him his award. And he was very, very, very proud of that award.
Very nice. And so actually, I'm sorry that we can't get to more questions. Our time has come to an end, but I encourage everybody to purchase the book at your local bookstore. You can read more stories about Art and specialty records. Thank you, Billy, very much for joining us. Thank you, Nadine. I will send an email out probably at the beginning of next week that will include a link to the recording and a link to the book as well. Please sign up, register for next week. We have Israeli singer-songwriter David Broza, as well as a program about Jan Karski, a witness to the Holocaust. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Billy. Thank you, Suzanne.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everyone.